Welcome to the Action for Happiness podcast. As always, I'm your host, Guy. Action for Happiness is a movement of people committed to building a happier and more caring society. Visit the website actionforhappiness.org for more details and to access the latest podcasts and videos. On today's episode, I turn the mic around on fellow podcaster and mindfulness teacher, Ted Meissner. Ted hosts one of the most influential podcasts on mindfulness called Present Moment Mindfulness. And for me, it's my go-to podcast series. Ted has over 100 podcast conversations with experts, practitioners, and influencers in the mindfulness space. And we talk about the common themes and learning lessons he's had after interviewing so many amazing people. And we dig into topics such as, is mindfulness for everyone?
I have always been a skeptic, not a denier, but a skeptic, which is show me how you know this to be so, whatever it is. Mindfulness, and I say this quite frequently, it's not magic, it's not a cure-all, and it is occasionally inappropriate for some people to engage in a mindfulness program. I'd say one suggestion that I give people in any kind of endeavor is do a little bit of research first. Find out what this is like, find out what it is that you're interested in about it.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to get updates on the latest video and audio podcasts.
Hi there, Guy. How are you?
I'm very good, my friend. And you?
Good. Very nice to see you.
And you, this is what you look like.
This is what I look like. It's pretty much like this.
Yes.
And as long as I'm not holding a number in front of me, we're good.
Okay, perfect. I've been listening to your podcast now for a couple of years, and out of the, I think when you practice mindfulness, you're quite keen to find a community where you can share experiences, ask questions, because it can get to a point where it's very, very profound, and you're learning about yourself, and you're struggling a lot. And so I was seeking I wanted to hear what other people were thinking and talking about it. And I came across your podcast in a Google search, and I've been hooked ever since. What I like about it is that it's not just like the experts, or it's very balanced. You have, people that are practitioners, people that are, teachers, people that are going into the prisons. And so, in the present moment fashion, I think my first question, to pay tribute to your first question, is to, tell us a bit about your background, Ted. We're the Action for Happiness, and our message is, all about how do we help, increase happiness and reduce suffering. And so when we heard, I suggested having you on the show, we really feel that this is a wonderful fit. So if you please to just give us a bit about your background, how you got into mindfulness, and also how the podcast came about.
Well, thank you very much. And first, I just want to express my gratitude to you for all of your work with Action for Happiness podcast. And it's quite an honor for me to be here. Your recent episode with Rob Beamer about the movie,
yes,
and feeling a bit odd being in the august presence of Mark Williamson, John Kabat-Zinn, Daniel Goleman, Willem Kaken, other guests that you've had is really
and Mathieu Ricard's to come this week as well. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for this. So my own journey started in the early 90s and having difficulty with concentration and focus and just having attention be where I want it to be. And so I took an introductory to mindfulness program on a weekend at the local Zen Center in Minneapolis at the time, is where I lived. And it was the most difficult 10-minute sit I have ever done ever since, because it was the first time I'd actually taken a look inside and saw how very active the mind is, this hamster wheel running very fast inside my head. And it was also a bit of a challenge, because at the time, really the only place nearby to practice with a group was in a particular context, in traditional context. And that was a wonderful place to be. And the more I practiced, the more it became very difficult to turn away or avoid who I was and the growing that I really needed to do. That's part of the practice. You're looking closely, and it's not always the pretty nice things that you want to see about yourself. So I continued with that for many years and through a couple of different mainline branches in traditional Buddhism. And after some time found that I'm wondering if there are other people out there like me who are contemporary, science-minded Midwest Americans, where not all of the things that happen in a traditional context quite resonate with me. I'm not from India of 2,600 years ago, and so many of the things that are a part of that are a little different for me, much as I have a deep appreciation for them. Still looking for a way to do this practice that's right for me, that meets me where I am. And so I started my first podcast, which is still going, The Secular Buddhist, and that was about 9 years ago. And that's gone along very well. And my background's in biology, my educational background. And so I'm very fond of evolutionary theory and principles. And the next evolutionary step I wanted to take was, what would this be? What would this exploration be if it's just the practice and in a contemporary setting, and it wasn't dependent on an ideological structure? What would that be like? And that was my first running across of MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction. Took my first class through University of Minnesota. Actually had a program and took that. And this was like coming home. This is what I've been looking for, and pursued teacher training and continued practice. And during that several year teacher training, decided to start another podcast, which is Present Moment Mindfulness. And that was about 5 years ago at this point. Just this morning, I published episode 108 for that, and that's going strong as well. And again, both of these podcasts is about exactly what you were saying, is contact with others and finding those and practicing together and seeing what that might be like and learning from one another, because I only have my own experiences, not yours or someone else's. And there's tremendous wisdom out there in the world, and stumbles too, and the wonderful totality of everything that life has for us. So that's where we are today.
So when I hear the word secular and Buddhism, so the more I got into mindfulness, the word secular kept popping up. And so how different is your podcast that's called, Secular Buddhism, to the Present Moment Mindfulness?
It's actually not all that different. In fact, many of the guests who have been on that are also on Present Moment. So there's still an exploration of scientific research. There's still meditation teachers and authors who don't teach in a traditional Buddhist setting. The word secular can have a lot of baggage with it. And honestly, I did a lot of wrestling with what's the right word here to describe how I am, because it's not quite traditional. And still having an admiration and wanting to honor those contexts, also recognizing it's not mine. I landed on secular not as an opposition to religious forms, because it's not at all, but rather a recognition of this being about this world, this life, the things that I can know for sure, as best we can know anything for sure, is that I am here in this life. I know I have this one. So what does the practice mean for me today? And that's really what the secular Buddhist has always been about. And that's really what Present Moment is about. We just focus more on the mindfulness communities and what we're seeing there through MBSR, MBCT, and other just ways of practicing, doing a contemplative practice.
Yeah.
Whoever you are, however you are.
Because the word can be quite tricky, because when I thought of Buddhism, which many people do, they put their religious layer, the religious lens on it. Then when you throw in the word secular, to a lot of people that means non-religious. All right. So when I first began talking about mindfulness and saying, oh, it's secular, someone correctly pointed out to me that, you don't want to give off the vibe that it's, you can be religious, you can be Catholic, you can be, Muslim, and still have the mindfulness. So it's that's really what I really loved about that. It's that this isn't tied into religion. It's one of those human truths, right? Like Newtonian, the physics. It's not Christian. It's just, it's just what it is.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the most rewarding things for me as a mindfulness teacher is at the end of a program, someone who has a completely different religious background from me will say, this brought me closer to my faith. And the reason that is so positively moving for me is it's what's closest to them, what is most meaningful to them in their lives. That, to me, is just an amazingly rewarding aspect of being a mindfulness teacher. Is my most recent class online had 6 different countries, a dozen different states, and people from at least 3 or 4 completely different religious denominations.
Yeah.
And all found tremendous value out of it because this is what speaks to us as people. Honestly, that's been the interest for me in Buddhism. Is what we do speaks to who we are, what we are, how we meet the world. That's the value to me.
Yeah, and what I love about someone that's been in this world is I really try and draw from them the common themes that have remained true. So you're saying you've passed the century of podcast episodes, right? We say 108 now, yeah.
108 for Present Moment, and the Secular Buddhist is 289. We're approaching 300 for that one.
Wow. Yeah. So, if you were to put a book together, a tell-all book about all your experiences, what has been the biggest learning lessons for you along the way, and what are those themes that do remain true, and and that you can share with us?
Well, that's a great question. The biggest learning for me is it's very closely with what I'm running into in my own practice, which is meeting people where they are. That's been, an evolutionary change for me. It had been the original template I had in my head in meditation is there's someone up on the mountain seat, there's a person at the head of a class, they're in robes, and they give a lecture, and you go practice. And instead finding that how we engage with just basic attentional practices in meditation is across the board. And we don't have to have a particular striving for a goal. And that, in fact, I found that difficult in my own practice. It became much more helpful to me to ease my grip on that. So I'd say the biggest learnings for me have been get out of my own way, because I get in my way a lot. Really deeply listening to others and the brilliance that they have to share, even when I don't get it. When they first say something or share something, it doesn't mean that it's not extremely insightful, and give myself a little time to catch up with that.
Yeah.
Because that's very helpful in and of itself. And then the other part is even someone who prefers solitude and is a bit of an introvert despite having podcasts, that practicing with others, that this human connection is amazingly supportive
Mm-hmm.
and a wonderful way to really, really be able to take a wide and deep look about life
Mm-hmm.
and give me some new perspectives on how I'm meeting it. Because
Yeah.
again, that self keeps getting in the way.
Yeah. I have lots of enthusiasm about mindfulness, and I have a co-host that unfortunately couldn't be here today, but he likes to play I call it, he's the scolder to my Mulder, Scully to my Mulder. And he likes to repeat the phrase, don't let the enthusiasm run ahead too much of the science. And I hate doing that because it's I'm from the point of view where we should be screaming it from the top of the mountain hills. Like everyone must, but then again, I come across as patronizing, and it's like someone talking about their religion or yoga, and it's, what is your take on that? Just being so immersed in that world. Are you that don't let the enthusiasm run ahead of the science, or what's your stance on that?
It's a really, this is one of the things I'm also wrestling with is appreciating complexity, because I want simple answers.
Yeah.
That's my knee-jerk reaction to things. I want the easy button, and this is complex.
Yeah.
And what I've found is I have always been a skeptic, not a denier, but a skeptic, which is show me how you know this to be so, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so anytime there's scientific research, I'll go in and read the paper itself,
Mm-hmm.
because the headlines, and we see this in particularly now, because when I started, there wasn't online social networking wasn't a thing yet.
Yeah.
There's a lot of inadvertently poor science journalism.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of, with the best intentions, science journalism that nonetheless creates a title, for example, in a popular science article that is completely wrong and doesn't even vaguely say what the authors say in the research. So a healthy skepticism, I think, is very helpful. Read the paper itself, not just the title of the popular media article.
But that's tough, though. We have a lot of people don't have the time, and it's small font.
It is. It's very tough. Yeah, and that's so. Two things I would offer for that. That's one reason I do the podcast, is to allow researchers to have their own voice and share what they mean in human terms.
Yes.
Because scientific papers are often best read by other researchers who understand what the languaging means. I was very fortunate last year to be a co-author on a paper. Lead author is Nicholas Van Dam, and the title is Mind of Hype. And there's about 15 of us who are very concerned about what we're seeing about overhyped promises about mindfulness, because we can see that as damaging. And so we talk about, mindfulness can have many definitions. It's not always consistently applied. Research is very young, despite going on for nearly 40 years. And we feel, because we're all passionate about the practice, this is not taking it apart. This is hopefully making it strong by suggesting that we up our game as researchers on active control groups, for example, and the instruments we use. And in particular, one of the things I was interested in is what's shared in the media, and how is that itself a very important tool in helping people understand who are not researchers about what we mean. Yeah. And of course, the paper itself is very popular and is a victim to its own success, in that it's misquoted quite a lot. And whenever I find that, I go in and, if possible, make a comment on whatever site it's sending people in the wrong direction, or sometimes just reach out directly to the author and provide some more information about what it is we actually said versus what showed up. But it's a struggle, and it's ongoing.
You're listening to the Action for Happiness podcast. This episode, we speak with podcaster and mindfulness instructor Ted Meissner. host of the Present Moment Mindfulness podcast. There have been quite a few articles which highlight or claim to highlight the negative aspects of mindfulness, and I'm sure you've come across them as well. Do you recall any of those articles that you've agreed with?
There are, in almost all of them, there is something that I agree with.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the author of the oft-quoted McMindfulness article, David Loy and Ron Purser co-authored that. David's a dear friend. Ron is a friend. I had them on the Secular Buddhist to talk about it. And Ron has continued to publish papers. So often mind the hype. Mm-hmm. Always be careful about these things. I agree with that completely, because there are, in addition to having many very well-trained and competent teachers out there, there are also those who may be great teachers and may not be. And the lay public won't really be able to tell the difference. While in a course that there's a reason why more experienced teachers might not phrase things a certain way that someone without experience wouldn't.
Yeah.
So
you're saying it's not the mindfulness itself, it's the way in which it is taught, right?
Presented. Yeah.
Presented.
Because, for example, mindfulness, and I say this quite frequently, it's not magic, it's not a cure-all. And it is occasionally inappropriate for some people to engage in a mindfulness program. There are reasons why a good check for me about the level of interest in the well-being of participants is, do you just register and you're in, or do you apply? Mm-hmm. And is there a review of how you are? In every one of my classes that I've been teaching, I do a review, and many of the people who apply don't get in because this wouldn't be the right time for them. And that is also supported by the literature. Mm-hmm. So while there are some problems that occur, in these articles you're mentioning, they will often aggrandize one or two cases that were not in the context of a secular mindfulness program. So there's a little bit of a disingenuous lack of providing information.
Right.
This occurred at in a Buddhist setting. This was not a secular mindfulness program.
Yeah.
And there was not a teacher who has received their credentials from an institution with, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of nuance to that. And they also will use a technique of guilt by association by saying the military is bad, corporations are greedy, and when we teach mindfulness in the military, it's therefore bad. And because corporations are greedy, corporate mindfulness programs are bad.
Yeah,
I've taught in the corporate world. I disagree with that.
Yeah,
for many reasons. So while there are some aspects I agree with, there are also many that I don't. And it's, again, for someone just reading it for the first time, there may be oh boy, I got to get away from this mindfulness thing. It's not for me. It's like, well, let's really take a closer look at what they said, because I find those often to be a bit disingenuous.
So if taught in the right way, is mindfulness for everybody?
Even if taught in the right way, it's not for everybody.
Can you give me some examples where it's not?
Yeah. So, for example, let's say someone is in the middle of a major depressive episode. They have thoughts of self-harm, perhaps taking their own life. They are not being treated. They have no professional counseling or therapy.
Yeah.
This would probably not be the right time for that person to take a program where they're taking a very close look at what the thoughts are, without being able just neurologically to have a degree of context with that, not distancing themselves, but also not getting overwhelmed by them. The overwhelm proximity is just, it's too much then. And another example would be someone who is very actively suffering from a severe PTSD, and again, untreated. There's a wonderful book that just came out by David Treleaven, and it's PTSD Sensitive Mindfulness, I think is the title for that. And it goes into why there are situations where this is just not well timed. And once someone is in therapy and perhaps in collaboration with their therapist and active monitoring, that might be a right time. So it's not so much that it's not for everyone, is what is the right time for someone to take a mindfulness program? Because their well-being is the most important thing, not taking the program or getting another participant. It's how are people doing?
I mean, I think one thing that, I think he's an alumni as well, Dr. Willem Kuken out of the Oxford Mindfulness Centre. We actually drove down there. We did a bit of filming. He's an awesome guy.
Yeah.
I think one of the things he mentioned was that in one of the researches they'd done about a group of suicidal candidates, right, for lack of a better term, and one of the outcomes of this was that although after the 8-week course, quite a few were still depressive and, still had negative thoughts, the thought of suicide, it never escalated to that final thought, all right, this is it, I want to end it all now. So although, it didn't stop them from being negative thinking and having suicidal thoughts, versus the group that didn't have the training and the number of suicides for those that were non-treated.
Right.
And I just feel like, so let's say PTSD or you're suffering from a big depression. If someone were to explain to you throughout this 8-week course the nature of thoughts and say, hey, by the way, it's actually an evolutionary gift that this craziness is going on, and you should treat it with kindness, and say, your ancestors for thousands of generations have been able to survive because you've always been on the look. And if someone said to you, there are some tools where you can actually change the relationship with it, why would that not be beneficial? Why about the negativity bias? Let them realize that the most of your thoughts about the past or the future and negative, and just help them come, even if they don't do a minute of meditation, just to come to a bit of realization that, hey, this is not on you. This is for everyone. We're all thinking all the time. The thoughts are majority are negative. There's a few things you can do to kind of change your relationship with that. If I'm suffering from PTSD and if I'm in a having a big period where I'm in this big depression, would that not be, rather than medication, wouldn't that not be just a very crucial part of the healing process?
I think it is definitely a part of the healing process. And so it's not an either or, there's an and here. An intellectual understanding of something can actually be triggering for some people, depending on where they are. And again, David's book has an excellent example of exactly the case you're talking about, where, but we'll share this information and that will fix things, and describes a scenario where an individual was suffering. And their therapist, actually, they thought, I've been taking this mindfulness program. Here, let's do a thing and we'll get you in close to your feelings and your thoughts. And that was actually quite harmful. It sent the person into overwhelm and made things worse. Yeah. And this was through the best of intentions, sharing what for others, as you've said, would be very helpful information. Again, there's the complexity of this requires, I think it's responsible. We as teachers are responsible for doing our best to ensure, much as I'm very enthusiastic about this, and I know that it can help, it has certainly helped me in very significant circumstances. There are also times I've needed to step back from it.
Sure.
And we also need to honor that as part of an ongoing pathway of engagement with what life holds. So Yeah, it would seem like, oh, with this, even just planting a seed, and one can certainly have a conversation about that. But practice itself can be difficult and
Mm-hmm.
can send people can trigger
Right. So
some folks.
but what if you are then introduced to this at a young age where it becomes one of your life skills? Like Daniel Goleman calls it that trait, so that you don't let it build up and build up, so that when you're later on, you're just so, you know what I mean? You're so not familiar with this, you're just so intertwined with your thought patterns that when you go into it, when something triggers it, then you're just lost. Versus, training yourself day after day for those 10, 15 minutes where you're just training that muscle of attention where it's like, no, back to the breath, back to the breath, regardless, I don't care what the thought is, right? So that later on, you're not this, I don't know, it's just like, for me, the way that I just see it in my mind is like perhaps like a build up of, because it's untrained. You're living your life, not realizing that this thought pattern, the number of thoughts are just continuous throughout the day, which are playing such a big, important role in your decision making and how you're feeling.
Mm-hmm.
That perhaps if you're at a younger age, when it becomes part of your education, a tool that you have in your toolbox, that, then so that, and I think William Kukan also called it a 1 billion person problem, depression.
Yep.
It is something that's very pervasive in our culture today, right?
Yeah, and I completely agree. I'm a very big advocate for having mindfulness taught at an early age. I think about the problems it would have perhaps helped with in my own growing up, and as you're saying, he absolutely correctly, that if one has a certain versatility and experience with contemplative practice,
Yeah.
when very difficult things come about, there's a little bit more resiliency in dealing with them.
Yeah.
I was a meditator for, I think, about 15 years when I got a cancer diagnosis that
Oh, wow.
my brother had died of 2 years before. Grandfather died at age 39. So one would think this would be a bit scary and a bit concerning. And of course, certain emotions did arise.
Yeah.
But I got this news right after going on a retreat, and so it was in a really good place anyway to simply receive. And my experience was, I think, very different from some others who had not had the benefit of years of practice.
Yes.
And there's a journal that at the time, I don't know if they still do this. This is at Hubert Humphrey Cancer Center in Minnesota. In the waiting room, they have a little journal for people to write whatever they want.
Yeah.
And looking at this journal was, it was filled with what one would expect, with pain and fear and rage and all the rest about this incredibly trying experience that people were having, which wasn't really my experience, because the perspective was maybe a little bit different for me thanks to practice.
Yeah. So, if someone that's getting into meditation, or, for perhaps our younger audience, what words of advice, if they're joining in now and, they're perhaps interested in getting into meditation, mindfulness, what advice would you give, to help someone, spur them on their way?
I'd say one suggestion that I give people in any kind of endeavor is do a little bit of research first. Find out what this is like. Find out what it is that you're interested in about it. Why do you want to do this? For me, it was I have problems with attention. And once I started, it was, and I need to shift who I am, because that's not so good.
Yeah.
So do some reading. There are lots of materials that are available, some very good books. Some new ones have just come out that are good programs for younger adults and kids, K through 12, different ages, and those different ages have different needs.
Yeah.
So it's, a full MBSR program with those commitments would probably not be appropriate for an 8-year-old. So there are different programs that Mindful Schools does a great job.
The .B program, yeah.
.B program is another wonderful one. The Goldie Hawn's Hawn Foundation and their Mind Up program is another. And I just did an interview for those who are more interested in a traditional setting. Sumi Kim's books that are recent on family-based mindfulness practice are also beautifully done. She did a terrific job on those. So do some checking first and see what appeals to you. And then finding a teacher that you trust, for which there's an open dialogue and not well, sure, I'll teach you. Here's this year-long contract at a huge price. That might be a red flag.
Top 2 guests you would love to have on your show?
Top 2 guests I would like to have on the show. There are lots of guests I would like to have. Fortunately, the first one has already agreed. It's just a matter of getting him nailed down. And as you know, I've run into this yourself, is John Kabat-Zinn. He really enjoyed the conversation, one of the conversations I'd had with Becca Crane on a paper she and John and Willem Kaken and others wrote, and Willem came on after that. So John would be one. And another, I would like to talk to Daniel Goleman about his work. I know you've had him on the podcast. His son Hanuman has been on my podcasts. And then if we're really breaking the ceiling wide open,
let's push. Go ahead.
I would say that the Dalai Lama might be a nice guest, just to see, and in particular, talk with him about some, I think, positive things he has said about. It's not really about the Buddhism; it's about how we are in the world, and that's the most important thing. So, those would be my dream top 3.
The Action for Happiness actually hosted a day when the Dalai Lama came down and spoke about 2-3 years ago. So I was part of the interviewing team that day. So I actually got Matthew Ricard, Daniel Goleman, Richard Davidson all in one day. It was only literally 1 or 2 questions per.
Yeah.
But the Dalai Lama was wandering around, and that was really the one that. But the security was really tight. The security was really tight, but it was just to see him there and hear him talk, live and face to face. That was pretty awesome. So last question, Ted. In the Action for Happiness fashion, what matters most to you?
So on a personal level, of course, my family, including my 4-footed family. And then on a wider scale, just an ongoing connection that I think is best supported by practicing deep listening, which can be very difficult. And it's one of my teaching edges is the listening, and just seeing how that really changes things, how that really shifts things. Because we today, in particular, in our society, there's a little bit too much of this fist shaking, a little bit less of the open welcoming. So, just that.
Wonderful. All right, so the website where people can find out about not only your podcast, but online courses as well, right? Or are they face-to-face?
Yeah, so presentmomentmindfulness.com is the website. And on that, I'm, as of this recording, taking applications for the Spring 2018 program, which is a live online. There are right now very few places where you can find MBSR live online. Even fewer. This may be the only one at this time that's on a donation basis. So I do encourage people who have considered taking the course and have wanted to, please visit, because it's really been an amazing experience in teaching and in welcoming people to this new practice, or even those who are very experienced who've taken and are like, yeah, this is different. It's not what I was expecting. Yeah. And being able to establish the kinds of connections one does in person through a screen, Brady Bunch style, and still that tends to vanish after the first session. And this is one fairly consistent comment, is people are always very surprised. I thought this would be a little weird, and really after the first class it wasn't, and it was just wonderful seeing everyone every week. So, presentmomentmindfulness.com.
And remember, if you'd like to help create a kinder and happier world, please get involved with Action for Happiness. You can join thousands of others who are spreading a bit more happiness in their homes, workplaces, schools, and local communities. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and follow to keep up to date with all our content. Find out more at actionforhappiness.org. Join the movement, be the change.